для эвакуации. Повторяю, направляйтесь в госпиталь милосердия.
На метро можно добраться прямо до госпиталя милосердия. Неплохая мысль.
Hi, my name is Gabe Newell, and welcome to Left4dead. Left4dead is our first attempt to combine the strengths of single-player and multiplayer games. We wanted to take the character-driven storytelling of our single-player games, like Half-Life, and combine it with the social replayability of our multiplayer games.
We experimented with a variety of different introductions for each.
While we were developing bots for Counter-Strike Source, we discovered that a few of us armed to the teeth with automatic weaponry against 30 knife-wielding enemy bots was a lot of fun. After shipping Counter-Strike Source in late 2004, we started experimenting with new game prototypes. That basic kernel of small team of friends against hordes of clawing enemies was something we kept coming back to, and we soon realized that the co-op versus the horde game had a ton of potential. We started work in earnest on what was to become Left4Dead in early 2005, and in about a week, we had a very rough but very playable and fun prototype. We began our daily cycle of playtest.
Left4Dead requires a variety of areas off the main path where the infected can spawn. We learned that once we had created these spaces, players naturally wanted to explore them. So fairly late in development, we decided to reward the players for going into these areas by allowing the random creation of bonus items such as pain pills, Molotovs, pipe bombs, and extra pistols.
We treat the infected horde as a major character in Left4Dead and spend a lot of effort in making their movements believable. This includes hundreds of motion captured animations that are algorithmically blended with the physics system to create characters that realistically interact with their environment and each other. The common hordes stagger around, cough, vomit, fight amongst themselves, lean against walls, sit on the ground, and lie down as part of their wandering behaviors. If something wakes them from their stupor, they become alert and look around for the source of the disturbance. When they see a survivor, they become enraged and acquire that survivor as a target, taking off at a full sprint, leaning into their turns, jumping and climbing over everything in their way, trying to get to their victim. We wanted to express this rage in their faces as well, so we found efficient ways for each member of the horde to make intense facial expressions. We chose to make their eyes a solid milky white, partially because it looks creepy and disturbing, but also because it's much less expensive than drawing and controlling separate eyeballs for each infected.
The most common attitude toward music in multiplayer games is that it just gets in the way. We wanted the music in Left4Dead to heighten the key emotional elements that should be inherent in a horror game, keeping in mind that everything in a game should contribute to gameplay. Therefore, we made a simple set of goals that the music should meet to keep people from turning it off. Players who leave the music on are treated to a variety of subtle audio cues that not only deepen the horror experience, but make them better players.
Once the game is in a playable state, we bring in friends and family who've never played the game to playtest specific areas, maps, or campaigns. These players bring a fresh perspective and objectivity to the game experience that often gives us new insights into what's working and what's not in our games. We observe their play and experience their exhilarations and frustrations. While playing, we encourage them to talk and ask questions to get a better idea of what they're thinking, though we let them know that we won't be able to answer any of those questions or offer any help. Watching these playtests helps us to tune the game so that the first-time players understand the game mechanics and the basic premise for how the game is played, and that we're achieving the right balance of challenges and rewards. After the play session is complete, there's a final Q&A session where we ask them about their experience to gain more specific insight than we were able to obtain through observation. One approach we use here is to ask them what the best and worst moments of the experience were for them and why. This is especially useful feedback to help us identify and prioritize our key issues and improving.
The designs of the boss infected were driven directly from weaknesses observed during our daily playtesting. For example, in the very early days of the game, there were only common infected. As a result, the survivors had a very simple rule of shoot everything that moves. Although this was fun, it lacked tactical depth and variety. The Boomer's goal was to shake this.
The Screamer was a boss zombie who didn't have any actual attacks. He was bound in a straitjacket. You knew when he was around because of his crazed, maniacal cackling. The trick to the Screamer was that if he saw you, you had a moment to kill him before he ran away. And once the Screamer got away from the survivors to a hiding place, he would emit a loud, howling scream that would cause a huge mob of zombies to attack the survivors. While there were several exciting moments of knowing you had to chase him down to shoot him before he screamed, dodging zombies all the way, ultimately it proved too confusing for the survivors to discover how he worked or even to reliably notice him in the crowd. He was cut, and his horde drawing attack eventually evolved into the Boomer attack.
To overcome the horror and darkness of Left 4 Dead, our highest priority was to create 4 believable people for the survivors, which you could connect with. With the design of Francis, we were looking for a large, imposing character that would fit in well during the zombie apocalypse. He needed to feel huge, fit believably into the world, and read well as a silhouette. The biker look was a strong choice, as the read of bare arms, a stained white shirt, and leather waistcoat, all on a 6'5" frame, certainly made for him.
To find a coherent visual look for Left 4 Dead, we first had to make choices that would help enhance gameplay in a very dark setting. The darkness is crucial to Left 4 Dead, as it forces players to stick together and encourages cooperative gameplay. We took advantage of lessons learned from our previous work on Team Fortress 2.
When we started what was to become Left 4 Dead in late 2004, or Terror Strike as it was known at the time, our team was quite small. However, we knew we had certain strengths, one of them being AI.
Anyone designing a post-apocalyptic city has to deal with the problem of how to light it. Initially, our take on it was
Local contrast adjustment is another film effect we've implemented in Left 4 Dead. We control contrast dynamically keyed to peak events in the game. When everything suddenly gets sharper, this is a
Перезаряжаю!
Car alarms are an example of what we call panic events, brief, intense, and maybe avoidable moments. In the classic post-apocalyptic
Buildings by nature tend to be pretty square, and if there's a well-lit building with a dark sky behind it, you clearly see the squareness of the building, no matter how many AC units, chimneys, or other interesting shapes are stuck on top of it. So what we did here was flip the typical lighting scheme and put a bright sky behind dark buildings. Suddenly, the pipes and chimneys blend into the building's silhouette. Now, instead of seeing individual details like the AC units, you're seeing a much more complex, organic-looking skyline in the background. And because the mind expects a similar level of detail throughout an object, your imagination fills in the details.
Early versions of Left 4 Dead allowed more skillful players to run off on their own without much fear of deadly consequences, bobbing and weaving around the infected before they could react. The addition of player slowdown, when hit by a common infected, severely reduced the player's ability to simply run straight through the horde. More importantly, the Hunter Pounce and Smoker Hang presented fatal situations.
Мы это сделали. Можете в это поверить?
Through playtesting, we found that Left 4 Dead's unique cooperation mechanics were tricky even for seasoned gamers to grasp immediately. Failing because of rules that are not clear is never fun. Therefore, we designed the game instructor system to educate players as quickly as possible. Because first-time players can potentially join an in-progress game at any point, it was critical that the game instructor dynamically interpret game events. It keeps a running list of the lessons that can be taught in the current context and displays the ones that are most important. It also tracks how many times the player has successfully demonstrated that they've learned the lesson. Once the player has proven competence at any specific lesson, the hint is never shown again.
Эта штука, похоже, опасна. Перезаряжаю.
Left 4 Dead evolved some of the contextual dialogue technology that we used in the Orange Box. Each survivor has a large database of lines to choose from based on their present activity and a variety of factors, such as their health, stress level, kinds of special infected scenes.
Another way we try and give players a new experience every time they play Left 4 Dead is that in addition to randomly placing bonus items like pain pills and pipe bombs, we vary the location of the more powerful weapons: the auto shotgun, the assault rifle, and the hunting rifle. These weapons will always appear somewhere in the main path, but there are 4 different areas in the subway station where they can spawn. This means that players can't take these positions for granted on repeated playthroughs, and must keep their eyes open for the weapon upgrades.
Перезаряжаю. Я перезаряжаю.
Although it sounds ridiculous to talk about advanced zombie AI, we spent a great deal of time on the AI systems for the common horde. First and foremost is their ability to navigate. The environments in Left 4 Dead are geometrically...
This covered body is an example of how we tell a story in the levels without using any words or overt storytelling. We wanted to show that there are other people in the world that are survivors like you. We figured most people wouldn't survive very long, and you'd come across their bodies. But we needed a way to set these apart from all the dead ragdolls of the common infected. By simply covering a body with a blanket or a sheet, it becomes really obvious that this guy had a buddy, a friend. And when he went down, his friend had compassion and covered him up. This also tells a story about the state of the world, that they wouldn't want to go out and bury the body. They couldn't expose themselves to infected. So they'd have the bodies right there with them, but covered. Sometimes you'll see a covered body right outside a checkpoint. So it's like they were in a safe area, and maybe during the night their buddy died from his wounds. So the next morning the other survivors didn't really want the body in there with them, so they dragged it outside. This was the best they could do for the guy.
Я перезаряжаю.
Smoking the set is a common film technique used to help separate background and foreground elements. We use particles and distance-based fog to do our own version of smoking. Our first experiments proved frustrating for players. We used a realistic dark fog, but this obscured character silhouettes and gave no sense of the vast surrounding environment. Once we lightened up the fog, the maps gained a greater sense of scale and distance.
Early playtesting revealed that players often didn't know that other survivors were in need of help, even though the status of the other survivors at the bottom of the screen changed to red. When being attacked by a horde of zombies, we found players focusing exclusively on the in-game action and missing any changes to the HUD and the other player's status. We solved this problem by using glows around the silhouettes of the survivors' character models. We use red glows when other survivors are in need of assistance, and blue glows to show the survivors' location.
In Left 4 Dead, players carry flashlights to illuminate the environment. These shadow-casting light sources not only add surface richness and provide important visual depth cues, they tie into gameplay. For example, because a player's flashlight is attached to his or her weapon, the light becomes pointed off to the side when reloading or performing a shove attack. In a sufficiently dark area, this can cause the player to be effectively blind until they are done reloading or shoving back an enemy.
Before there were rescue closets, survivors who died during the game had to wait until the next checkpoint before they could rejoin. As the game matured, the time between checkpoints reached 10 to 15 minutes, clearly too long for a player to sit in spectator mode. Although it may seem obvious,
we set out to create an interesting trade-off between the pipe bomb and the Molotov from day one. Given the limit of a single item in your inventory, the choice needed to be meaningful. From early on, the Molotov was a clear winner, providing a dynamic area of denial with interesting strategic purposes and pitfalls, especially against the boss infected. The pipe bomb was intended to provide a balance against a rampaging horde, but initially it proved far less successful. Given the frenetic pace of enemies in action in Left 4 Dead, with typical engagement ranges of 5 to 10 feet, using a traditional pipe bomb in any sort of intentional way was nearly impossible. You'd see a mob of zombies, whip out the pipe bomb, and by the time you were winding up for a throw, they'd already be eating your face. No amount of tweaks to the detonation mechanic or timing solved this issue. It simply wasn't fun. Given that the horde is drawn to shrill...
At one point in the development process, playtesters told us that with the exception of the finale maps, they found the experience of going through a campaign fairly flat, with not enough peak moments. So we decided to mix up the gameplay by creating crescendo events.
Crescendo events were the result of a lot of playtesting. Playtesters really love the finales, but since it can take like an hour or so to get to each one, they were missing these kinds of intense experiences along the way. What playtesters liked most about the finale was that it was the one time they were able to stop, catch a breath, make plans, and set up traps for the infected. During the rest of the campaign, you're always on the run, reacting to the infected and trying to move forward. So these crescendo events came out of wanting to get more of that planning and strategy into the rest of the campaign. These events also helped a bunch with team building. Like the minigun is really important, and if no one's manning it, your team probably won't do too well. But the minigunner is really vulnerable. They have a limited angle of view, they can't watch their backs anymore, so they have to depend on their teammates to cover them. With crescendo events on the way to the finale, we not only vary the pacing, but we help build the skills and coordination that will enable teams to survive the ultimate battle at the finale.
One distinguishing characteristic about Lewis is that he represents the everyday man. While Bill and Francis are characters who obviously live on the outskirts of society, Lewis is really the only one in the group who looks like he's trying to hold on to aspects of normalcy and civilization in a world of utter chaos. Designing a sleek fitted silhouette and adding detail elements such as designer shoes, necktie, and a designer watch not only distinguishes his character from the rest of the group, but also gives the player insight into who Lewis was prior to the apocalypse.
Вот таблетки! Перезаряжаю. Перезаряжаю. Вот таблетки.
Lighting was one of our toughest challenges. We had to find a light level that was atmospheric without striking players as frustrating or unfair. Wherever possible, we let lighting tell the story and enhance the gameplay.
Usually, each model in the game has its own unique texture maps painted specifically for that model, which give the object its surface colors and details.
Along with the boomer, the tank was one of our earliest bosses. Where the boomer broke the rule of shoot everything that moves, the tank changed the team's tactics to require immediate and direct cooperation against a single major threat. If everyone stays calm and engages the tank, they should be okay. If they panic and scatter, or if someone gets selfish and runs off, the team will likely die. One difficulty with the tank was that since we offset his incredible toughness by slowing him down a bit, when tank battles occurred in large outdoor spaces, he was far less effective. Coordinated survivor teams could easily take down the tank before he would close in on them and cause chaos. To offset this vulnerability, we added his rock throw and car slugging abilities. Now, if the tank finds himself far away from the survivors, he can still be effective by
One of the film techniques we relied on was color correction. Color correction simplifies and unifies the visual palette. Our color correction allows us to set a specific saturation threshold below which everything falls off towards gray, while critical items like health packs and blood stay bright and eye-catching. We also vary color correction by area. For instance, safe rooms have a warm color quality, evoking safety, in distinct contrast to the cooler palettes of the outdoors, which feel cold and forbidding.
Я перезаряжаю. Отлично.
Я-то готов, а ты?
Initially, designers placed the spawn locations for common infected mobs in each map. However, it became obvious after a few playthroughs that skilled survivors knew exactly where each of these were, killing the atmosphere of anticipation and constant danger. To address
network bandwidth usage when playing Left 4 Dead is a huge concern. We're constantly looking for ways to reduce how much data the server needs to send to each of the players. In most of our multiplayer games, we're only concerned with other players and their projectiles and weapons. But in Left 4 Dead, we must update not only the behavior of other players, but those of a horde of infected. In the hospital campaign, a lot of the surfaces are flat, such as halls and roadways. By making sure the infected only send their height when it changes, instead of giving complete position updates, we shaved almost 10% of the bandwidth from the server.
The process behind designing Zoe's character wasn't as straightforward as the other three. Developing a young female in a zombie apocalypse isn't easy with a backstory like hers. She had to be attractive and worn down at the same time. She needed to be tough and able to hold her own, even though she's occasionally terrified.
Our first maps created specifically for the game were giant non-linear city sections. The idea was that the survivor team would have to find their way through the zombie-infested city. Playtesting quickly revealed that keeping track of your teammates and fending off the hordes of zombies completely consumed players' attention. Adding on-the-fly discussions of which way to go were slow and frustrating. More importantly, however, was that the teams quickly found their favorite route and tended to always run.
Originally, the survivor's path forced them through a gas station convenience store and out by these pumps.
Due to the path, many players accidentally shot the pumps from close proximity.
This loading dock was another arena that we designated for our mini-finale. This time, instead of locking the survivors in a defensive position, we decided to have them ride the lift up to a rooftop encounter with the Horde.
Based on the success of procedurally populating the world with wanderers and mobs, we decided to try to guarantee a consistent dramatic experience for the survivors. Through playtesting, we observed sessions where some survivor teams would occasionally get into a downward spiral of being overwhelmed to the point that they were never able to regroup and get ahead. This was partially due to some poor choices of the survivor players in varying skill levels, but also due to the luck of the draw with the procedural population system. A random streak of bad dice rolls would either be incredibly exciting for some teams or a death sentence for others. To address this, we created a system that tracks each survivor's stress level by watching for events like how much damage are you taking, how many zombies have you killed near you, and so on. If a survivor's stress level gets too high, the system will step in and forcibly throttle back the zombie population system to make sure the team gets a break every now and then. These breaks are critical for a couple of reasons. The primary reason is battle fatigue. Constant fighting and gunfire is tiring. Secondly, the team needs an end to these skirmishes along the way to give them a chance to regroup, heal, and reassess. Lastly, these big exciting battles are only exciting if there are also periods of quiet, creepy, tension, and anticipation to contrast them against. This dramatic pacing is really critical to creating a fun experience. Once this system was in place, we realized we had all this useful information on how the survivor team is actually doing. From a dramatic standpoint, ideally we want to see the survivor team just make it into the next checkpoint, limping in, being chased by the Horde, so they can celebrate when the door closes and they yell, "We made it."
Я перезаряжаю.
One film technique we brought to Left 4 Dead was the idea of grain. Film grain is most apparent in dark scenes, which made it an attractive visual effect for our game. Grain does a good job of implying detail in darkness, adding grittiness and texture. However, we found in playtesting that if we applied grain uniformly, people would quickly tire of the effect. We hit upon a method for dynamically varying the grain effect based on light level. Scenes range from grainy texture in darkness and shadows to no grain at all in the brightest spots.
Все никак не привыкнуть к этому.
Перезаряжаю.
Может, хоть так дерьма нет этих зомби.
Я перезаряжаю. Перезаряжаю.
Left 4 Dead was created with the goal of being replayable. This goal causes a problem for writing, where characters will have the same speech opportunity multiple times over a single session. So we have to avoid having the speech become repetitive. We do that in multiple ways. One is to have almost all the speech have a random element to when it plays. This stops the player from being able to tune out the speech because it is expected for a certain action. We successfully tested this on Team Fortress 2 and have expanded on that system. In Left 4 Dead, not only does the initial speech have a random element, but we also have follow-up lines that may or may not play after the initial line, randomizing the speech opportunity further. We also limit how often some lines play. No matter how witty or funny a line is, you're sick of it the 100th time you hear it in an hour-long play session. To address this, our vocalization system allows us to control the rarity of individual lines or even complete speech opportunities. For instance, a speech opportunity...
For much of the development of Left 4 Dead, versus mode was the default and only mode. Balance problems eventually forced us to make it a separate game type. The problem was that if we balanced it to provide the survivors a reasonable chance of escape, the experience was a long and frustrating one for the player zombies. Changes that were necessary to make the player zombie experience satisfying also served to make the experience dramatically harder for the survivors. Separating versus mode allowed us to break out of this dilemma. Rather than aiming for a 50-50 shot at the survivors escaping, now we're aiming for a shorter, more intense experience where the survivors are unlikely to make it to the end. Their goal is simply to get further than the other team did. It's more fun for the zombies, and your reward for having a harder time as the survivors is that you get to switch teams after you're slaughtered and do the same to them.
This ladder, from day one, has always been a really exciting place in the campaign, because it forces the team to separate a bit, and players can't shoot while they're on the ladder. If a team's in great shape, they just fly through this area. But if the team is really hurting, everyone will stop and look at each other to see who has the most health. That guy will generally go up first, because chances are there's going to be infected up there. It's not always the case, but often enough that whoever goes up first is going to take a bit of a beating.
Перезаряжаю. Перезаряжаю. Скорее, бегом к госпиталю.
The witch is much rarer than the boomer, and her penalty is much more severe. Basically, if you shoot the witch, you will likely die. The witch has two functions. One is to provide an exception to the rule of shoot everything that moves. The primary function of the witch, however, is to force a change of pace on the survivor team. Ideally, discovering a witch near your path will result in the team going into stealth mode, shutting off their flashlights and walking carefully around her as to not disturb her. This is a large departure from the intense and loud pace of normal gameplay. In earlier versions of the witch's behavior, she was far more dangerous. Once she was set off, she went...
Кажется, тебе надо полечиться.
Valve has a long history of gathering real-world gameplay data and using that to improve our products. In Left 4 Dead, we automatically gather data from internal playtests and use that to tune the game. We look at every angle, including things like how often survivors help each other, how effective different types of infected are, how effective weapons are, and which weapons players favor. We learn a lot from analyzing gameplay data, and it lets us make decisions based on real information rather than guesswork. We will gather that same gameplay data from our real-world Left 4 Dead players and use that information to continue to improve the game. We'll also share the gameplay data we gather with the community as we do with...
Since killing zombies is such a big part of this game, we invested a lot of time into making their death animations more dramatic than simple ragdolls. We had a professional stuntman on a motion capture stage perform about 100 different dying animations from different kinds of weapons and hit from different directions, like from the front or behind. We then combined these mocap animations with the physics-driven ragdolls. The result is a really cinematic experience, with zombies that stumble for a few steps into a wall, then slide down the wall and collapse, for example. It's the best of both worlds.
We took several steps to keep the music interesting enough that the players would be inclined to keep it on as they play.
We keep it changing so it won't become tedious.
In Left 4 Dead, players are constantly getting attacked by mobs of common infected, and have lots of opportunities to view individual infected up close. Playtesters tend to notice and remember the variety of faces.
The idea that a bad decision by one player directly impacts the whole team is central to the design of Left 4 Dead. It is emotionally very powerful to know that you need your teammates to succeed, and to have clear and visceral feedback that you just made a mistake that is going to cost the team dearly. Examples include shooting a boomer that explodes on a friend, causing a horde of zombies to attack him, causing the witch to attack, which usually means someone is going to die, throwing a bad Molotov and burning your friends to a crisp, shooting a car alarm, causing all hell to break loose, running away and leaving your team incapacitated and dying, and of course, shooting your friend in the back as he was limping into the safe house, incapacitating him while the horde is hot on your heels.
A lot of overreaching dynamic music systems go to great lengths to organize and control a very expressive art form, often to the point of making the results perfectly controlled, but also perfectly boring. Our music director aims for planned serendipity. By designing
One of our goals when designing the 4 survivors was to have a very diverse group of real-world characters who fit in the post-apocalyptic storyline, but that also have heroic and aspirational qualities. Bill was a challenging...
The crescendo event centered on this elevator has a very simple mechanic: survive until the elevator arrives. In order to distinguish it from other crescendo events, we added breakable walls that allowed the horde to smash through, surprising the survivors and providing access for them to attack from all directions.
Перезаряжаю.
Перезаряжаю!
Я перезаряжаю.
We base the music on what the player is actually experiencing and not on what we want them to experience. Working from artificial life work our audio designers had done on Lord of the Rings and the Matrix sequels, we implemented a simple system to examine what's going on in the player's immediate environment, then added the appropriate reactive scalar rule sets to control the music and its volume levels. Most of the more prominent musical cues are thus reactive results from rule sets processing this input, making the musical experience specific to each player. This system also controls the dynamic mix system, another feature unique to Left 4 Dead.
Надо найти способ выбраться на крышу.
Another dialogue feature added for Left 4 Dead is the ability for characters to dynamically notice and comment upon objects in their world. In other Source games,
the first version of this area didn't have any openings on the walls at all. Everything was closed off. We decided that since you were so high up in the hospital and there wasn't any real geometry below, that we could add windows and use 3D skybox to provide this great vista. Once we put windows in, sometimes the hunter attack would push you out of the window. It became scary to get by those windows, and
given all the rooftop in the game, we saw Survivor falling off a lot, and it wasn't much fun. So we would make it all the way up here, heading for a checkpoint, and then a zombie would come around the corner, and they back right off the edge of the building and fall. We wanted to give them a second chance, and in the process encourage the cooperative type of gameplay we were aiming for. So we came up with the idea of having them grab the ledge and hang there until a teammate helped them. The nice thing about this feature is it also builds tension. As soon as you grab the ledge, the clock stops ticking. You watch your character go from hanging with 2 hands.
In playtests, people were often confused by certain events and elements in the game. The addition of musical cues helped distinguish these events and diminish player confusion. This was similar to the way that we experimented with distinct visual silhouettes in order to make our characters stand out in a chaotic environment. Audio silhouettes work on a preconscious level and are rarely perceived as intentional.
During our internal playtesting, we ran into situations where a player who had a habit of making bad decisions kept becoming incapacitated to the point where the other survivors became frustrated, continually reviving and escorting this player 5 or 6 times in the space of a couple of minutes. Adding the third strike and you're dead rule solved this issue 2 ways. First, it temporarily took these players out of the game and allowed the rest of the team to proceed and enjoy their experience. Second, the players who died
Players need to learn from their mistakes as quickly as possible. In early versions of Left 4 Dead, if survivors failed a campaign at any point, we just put them right back at the beginning and made them play the whole thing over again. That meant that if the team dies in the last level, it'll be close to 45 minutes before they ever get back to that map to try something new. This made it hard for players to remember exactly what they'd done wrong, and so it was hard for them to decide what they might want to do differently. So now, when a team goes down, we just reset to the beginning of the level.
All the music in Left 4 Dead, themes, motifs, hits, and effects, are based on a hybrid scale derived from the main opening menu theme. This theme, representing the near death of humanity as it fades to a distance only to be accessed through a radio, is an incremental melodic modulation, collecting up all the notes used along the way. The scale is not absolute, and some notes outside the scale are used occasionally to achieve even greater dissonance.
When players are moving through the world in a panic and trying to coordinate with their team, the last thing you want them to worry about is which key lets them crouch so they can scramble into a vent. Throughout the game, we tried to simplify movement controls so that players could enjoy the terror of the experience with as little frustration as possible. Here, and at similar obstacles, we make the survivor crouch automatically when they come to a vent. Wherever possible, we try to keep these decisions invisible to players, to keep the illusion that they're moving through this frightening world on instinct without ever thinking about controls.
The hospital rooftop is the finale that saw the most iterations. It's the first one that we ever built. The initial design had the survivors inside of a building with the helipad outside. You would fight inside the building till help arrived, and then you'd go out to the helipad to escape. We found that it was too easy for the survivors to back into a small room and hold out, just shooting the infected as they came through the doorway. This killed the drama because we'd have hundreds of infected attacking the rooftop, but you'd never see them, only the trickle that got through the doorway. We learned through playtests that survivors have a natural tendency to climb up on things. It's like the infected are a flood, and survivors are always trying to get to high ground.
Left 4 Dead was originally going to have a continuous story that started with the hospital campaign. When the chopper pilot picked you up, he would start talking about how he had just done a street pickup and wasn't feeling so well. Clearly he had just been infected, and the chopper was about to go down. We found that
highly cooperative and experienced survivor team can become very good at staying together and watching all around them, to the point that it becomes difficult for the zombie to cut the kind of chaos and panic that makes the game exciting. The smoker was created.
While special effects seem on the surface to be visual fluff, they also serve critical gameplay functions. Choose an example of the smoke.
The tank is an awesome presence on the battlefield. It's the only zombie that can withstand any amount of direct fire. To successfully combat a tank, the survivors need to work together and focus on their target, and even then the chance of catastrophe is high. With all of this power, it's a huge reward when a player gets to play the tank. We wanted to create something that...
In early playtests, when players controlled the tank, we had a major problem with them not behaving in character, totally breaking the game balance of the tank and making him a game ender almost every time. The problem was that an intelligent human player wants to win right now, and the tank was
Because Left 4 Dead is designed to be played over and over again, we made the dialogue scenes have as many variants as we could cram in. For instance, the encounter with the crazy church guy halfway through the Death Toll campaign includes more than 130 lines spread.
Early in the design of this rooftop scenario, the finale would start as soon as someone hit the radio button. We saw playtesters consistently run up and hit the button without preparing for the battle first. To let players know that they needed to prepare and to give them time to do it, we changed the design so that the pilot tells them to call him back when they're ready.
We knew we wanted homemade weaponry for Left 4 Dead, and a pipe bomb seemed ideal. However, for a long time, the pipe bomb wasn't very fun.
Because teamwork is so important to gameplay in Left 4 Dead, we wanted to give players feedback on how they...
While there are hundreds of infected types mobbing the player in Left 4 Dead, there are only 4 survivors.
From the start, focusing on cooperation was a primary design goal of Left 4 Dead. Although other games support cooperative play, extremely few actually require it. There are many core game mechanics in our game that require cooperation.
Traditional vignetting is a term from photography which refers to the slight darkening of the periphery of a photograph. In our vignetting approach, we darken only the top edge and corners. This focuses player attention down into the middle of the play space where it belongs, while also creating a sense of oppression or claustrophobia. This is a great example of how a visual enhancement can have a positive effect on the overall game experience as well.
Спасибо, Билл. Перезаряжаю.
Left 4 Dead was originally going to have a continuous story that started with the hospital campaign. When the chopper pilot picked you up, he would start talking about how he had just done a street pickup and wasn't feeling so well. Clearly he had just been infected and the chopper was about to go down. We found that this left playtesters feeling let down, instead of rewarded for having survived the challenging campaign. We decided to cut that section of the pilot's dialogue and kept the ending upbeat, reinforcing the player's sense of accomplishment.
While there are hundreds of infected types mobbing the player in Left 4 Dead, there are only 4 survivors. To make sure these 4 stood up to close scrutiny over many hours of playtime, we decided to use photographic reference of faces and wardrobe details. We started out by casting 4 individuals who fit the general design concepts we had created for our characters. These models were photographed on a turntable under both flat and dynamic lighting conditions in order to provide reference for modelers and texture artists. In addition, each model was photographed in a custom-built mirror box, which allows us to capture simultaneous front, right, left, top, and bottom views in a single shot. The talent was guided through a matrix of facial expressions, creating a complete catalog of movements and expressions for each character's face. This is an invaluable resource for our modelers and animators when they start to recreate these expressions in 3-dimensional models.
Left 4 Dead was originally going to have a continuous story that started with the hospital campaign. When the chopper pilot picked you up, he would start talking about how he had just done a street pickup and wasn't feeling so well. Clearly he had just been infected and the chopper was about to go down. We found that this left playtesters feeling let down, instead of rewarded for having survived the challenging campaign. We decided to cut that section of the pilot's dialogue and kept the ending upbeat, reinforcing the player's sense of accomplishment.
Granata!
From the start, focusing on cooperation was a primary design goal of Left 4 Dead. Although other games support cooperative play, extremely few actually require it. There are many core game mechanics in our game that require cooperation to succeed. One of the first that we added was having your character collapse to the ground, incapacitated and unable to move when your health reaches 0. You continue to lose health in this state and the zombies will continue to attack you. Once you're incapacitated, you will die unless a friend helps you back to your feet. Reviving an incapacitated friend takes 5 seconds, so it is a risky investment, as the rescuer is vulnerable and unable to defend himself during this time.
Early in the design of this rooftop scenario, the finale would start as soon as someone hit the radio button. We saw playtesters consistently run up and hit the button without preparing for the battle first. To let players know that they needed to prepare and to give them time to do it, we changed the design so that the pilot tells them to call him back when they're ready.
Ребята, мне срочно нужна помощь.
Все, не истерите, здесь. Все в порядке.
Спасибо. Лучше бы пилот вертолета оказался на месте.
Если не выйдет, хотя бы сдохнем вместе с красивым видом на город.
Я перезаряжаю. Сюда. Ребята, кажется, мы почти у цели.
Это посадочная площадка. Перезаряжаю!
Перезаряжаю.
Вы добрались. Теперь вам нужно лишь продержаться до моего прибытия. Но сначала подготовьтесь. Там должна быть стационарная пушка с боеприпасами. Это поможет вам отбиться. Я не смогу приземлиться, если вы не расчистите место. Когда будете готовы, вызывайте вертолет новостей.
Боеприпасы.
Я вылетел. 15 минут до цели. Постарайтесь продержаться. Вертолет новостей 5, конец связи.
Вертолет только что вылетел.
Начнем? Давай уже просто это сделаем. Перезаряжаю!
Перезаряжаю.
Курильщик, готовы! Перезаряжаю! Готов. Классный выстрел. Охотник!
Вертолет уже тут, идемте!
Бежим!
Еще чуть-чуть! Совсем чуть-чуть! Сюда! Скоро все это закончится.
Вы добрались. Теперь вам нужно лишь продержаться до моего прибытия. Но сначала подготовьтесь. Там должна быть стационарная пушка с боеприпасами. Это поможет вам открыться. Я не смогу приземлиться, если вы не расчистите. Когда вы вертолет на вас. Я вылетел. 15 минут до цели. Постарайтесь продержаться. Вертолет новостей 5, конец связи.
Держитесь, ребята, помощь идет. Отличный выстрел. Прикройте меня. Подбираю аптечку.
Перезаряжаю! Перезаряжаю! Мощный выстрел. Перезаряжаю!
Прямо в яблочко. Перезаряжаю. Ребята, вертолет уже тут! Идемте!
Бежим!